Good morning, and welcome to the Museum of the San Ramon Valley's virtual speaker series. I'm Dan Dunn, the director of the museum. Last month, we heard local author Donna Kemp Million tell us stories from her book, Cruising Down Memory Lane, Stories of Pleasanton in the 1950s. Today, another local author, Dan Hanel, will tell us about his interest in historic fiction with a local twist. I like a good mystery novel, and Dan delivers with hidden treasures, maybe supernatural beings, and mystic ancient symbols for us to unravel. Dan obviously loves his local history and tramping around the places that appear in his stories. He's been an educator for over 25 years, an award-winning science teacher. He was named the Distinguished High School Science Teacher for the state of California. He's also an award-winning school administrator at the high school, district, and county office levels. Dan grew up in Richmond, received a degree in biology from UC Berkeley, and a master's in education from Cal State Hayward. He lives with his family in the shadow of Diablo, which happens to be the sort of the binding elements for his books. Please use the chat window at the bottom of the screen for any questions that you have. Feel free to send in questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome in Dan Hanel. Dan?
Thank you so much. Great pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to chat about my books, which really gives me the opportunity to share some of the fascinating local history that I uncovered in doing the research behind them. So what I thought I would do in this talk, in the time that I have, is an overview of the series. In the Shadow of Diablo is the title of the series. There are 4 books in the series currently, and there is a historical inspiration behind each one, in addition to a mystery, as was mentioned by Dan in the introduction. And, well, probably we should just get started. Historical Mysteries of Contra Costa County. So let me get back into, there we go. So the first book in the series, the subtitle is Mystery of the Great Stone House. So the inspiration behind this book actually all started when I went to a fundraiser with my wife. We went to a fundraiser for an organization called the John Marsh Historic Trust. And that fundraiser was in front of this house. This is a 7,000 square foot stone mansion built in 1856. This is the John Marsh stone house. When I saw this place, I was somewhat in shock because this house was built in what is now present-day Brentwood. And I had been living in Brentwood for over a decade since then and had never seen this place, knew nothing about it until we went to the fundraiser in front of it. Thought, gosh, this is a really interesting place. How did it get here? And in the 1800s, this was clearly out in the middle of nowhere. So what's the story behind the house? That was the initial inspiration that led me to dig into the research where I tried to get as much primary documents as I could. The local historical societies, Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, etc. And it led me to the story of this man. So this is John Marsh. We'll talk a little bit at the end, but I actually do a lecture where I get to spend almost 2 hours just talking about the history behind this man, how he ended up in Brentwood, in Contra Costa County, etc. So you're just going to get a little taste of some of that fascinating history. But in general, John Marsh is well educated, grew up in Massachusetts, went to Harvard out there, began studying philosophy, got kicked out of Harvard, went back in, changed his major to medicine because he ended up wanting to be a doctor. He ended up moving out west in order to continue his studies, and eventually made it all the way to what at that time was Southern California and Pueblo, Los Angeles. He declared himself a doctor at that time, and from that point on, he became known as Dr. John Marsh. He had quite a few adventures between his life east and making it to Alta California, out west. One of them was falling in love and having a child, little boy named Charles. His first wife ended up passing away during their second childbirth, and he left his son Charles as a young boy with some family friends while he headed out west with the goal of setting up some property, building a home, and then he would send for Charles to come join him. He later got a letter back from the family friends indicating that, unfortunately, his son Charles had also passed away. So now John Marsh was out west all alone. He was doing doctoring, though he never actually received a doctoring credential. But if you're the only guy out west acting as a physician, you become a pretty important man. So he ended up making quite a bit of money. He headed up north a little ways and purchased some property. He named the property Rancho Las Maganos. He purchased initially 17,000 acres for $500. As he expanded his property, growing his wealth, that rancho eventually grew to over 40,000 acres. So here in an 1853 map of Rancho Las Maganos, that's roughly the 40,000 acres. There were indigenous people living at the site already, and John Marsh negotiated with them to help him build his adobe house, to help him grow his wheat, his orchards, his vineyards on the property, in exchange for his doctoring skills. So he's got a very nice setup going on. He sends a letter back east now at this time, asking for his son to be sent, which is when he received the letter that his son had actually passed away. Now, it's a little hard to tell from this map just where Rancho Las Maganos is, but if we take that map and we lay it over present day, so Marsh's house here in present day Brentwood, so his rancho incorporated all of Brentwood, all of Discovery Bay, all of Oakley, half of Antioch, from the river up to the foothills of Mount Diablo, East Contra Costa County. And this was all John Marsh's rancho. He created a wharf down here. There's still some signage for something called Marsh Landing, where he would then take his produce, his cattle, and then could ship it to San Francisco, to Stockton, or up to Sacramento. So he's becoming very, very wealthy. Eventually, he meets another woman. This is Abby Tuck. Abby Tuck was a school teacher living in San Jose at that time. And they just sort of ran into each other because Abby was actually out just taking a tour of the land and got lost, stumbled upon John Marsh's adobe house. The two met, the two fell for each other, and after an engagement, got married. Now, that engagement was 2 weeks long. So after 2 weeks of meeting, they married. Within a year, they had a child they named Alice. Here in this photograph, she's about 2 years old. So Marsh is doing well. He's got a new family, a young baby. Tragically, Abby passed away just a couple years after this photograph. We think probably from tuberculosis, according to the letters that were written back to her family back east in the description. And she was initially buried on the property under her favorite oak tree. As we'll see in a little bit, she did not remain there. So little Alice actually moves on to grow up and be raised by family friends in Oakland. Her father, John, figured that the wilderness was not really the place for a little girl to grow. Now, during this time, after meeting Abby and knowing that they were going to have a baby, John Marsh realized that this little adobe house that he had there was not going to suffice for a full family. And that's when he hired architects and engineers and built the stone mansion. And that lasted for just a few months. Because within a couple months of the house being built, John Marsh was on a business trip. He left his home in a horse and buggy, and he took the trail to Martinez. Martinez, he was going to catch a ferry to San Francisco to conduct his business. John Marsh never made it. On the trail in Martinez, he was confronted by 3 vaqueros. These were Mexican cowboys that were hired by Marsh to work his rancho. They, according to court records, accused Marsh of owing them money for work they had done. Marsh refused to pay them because he said they did not do the work that they were hired to do. They got into a conflict. One of them slashed Marsh's throat, left him on the side of the road to die. This marker is still there. If you're familiar with Pacheco Boulevard in Martinez, you can take that exit from the freeway, drive down towards Martinez, and you can find this marker on the side of the road, the site of the John Marsh murder. That is not the end of the story by any means. But we have his house still standing in Brentwood. 7,000 square foot stone mansion. It is currently the property of the California State Park System and within Marsh Creek State Park. So that story that I told, once again, is just barely touching the tip of the fascinating history in John Marsh's life. There's a lot that I had to leave out, given time, including things like the stranger that showed up at his door one day looking for a place to stay and rest after traveling from east. That stranger turned out to be a man named Charles Marsh, John Marsh's son, whom he thought dead decades ago, was not dead. And he finally tracked down his father out west, and they reunited just about 2 months before his father was murdered. Charles then spent the next decade of his life tracking down his father's murderer. So, fascinating tale, and this is the inspiration of my first book. Some of the topics: John Marsh, California's first doctor, and in fact, the first American to settle in all of Contra Costa County. His 7,000 square foot stone mansion. The reunion with his long lost son. His brutal murder in 1856. And A Fabled Treasure in Gold. As you'll find out in all of my books, there is, in fact, a mystery. They are historical mysteries. The fabled treasure of John Marsh's gold, as it turns out, is missing. Now, if you would like to know where his fabled treasure in gold is, well, that's why you got to read the book. So all of that real local history, people, places, and events, rather than just writing a biography of Marsh, are intertwined with a present day murder mystery. And so I have present day characters that follow clues to try to solve a murder. And as they do so, we learn about the past and the real life of John Marsh and his real life murder. So that's kind of how all of the books go. That was the fascinating history of John Marsh. Now, in writing the books, I figured, okay, I just wanted to see if I could write one book, and I got this one out. I thought I was done. However, people seemed to like it, and it was fun, fascinating doing the research. I enjoyed trying to create the storyline to bring the fictional and the fact together. But my challenge was trying to find other local history that was as fascinating as the John Marsh story, his murder, his gold. And as it turns out, there was a lot of other fascinating local history. Book 2, still in the shadow of Diablo, as the series title, subtitle, Death at the Healing Waters. And the inspiration for this place, at least, began with here. This is the Byron Salt Flats, owned by Risdon Iron Works in around 1870. So this is in the town of Byron. And if you're not familiar with Byron, you have to go as far east in Contra Costa County as you can go, and you'll find the little town of Byron. And it's still a little town. It was a little town in 1870, and it's still a little town in present day. But at that time, this landscape was salt flats. And Risdon Iron Works had moved into the area to smelt iron. They were making iron for the growing cities. The growing San Francisco, the growing Stockton, the growing Sacramento, all the forging works for the gold operations in the hills, they all needed iron. And one component of smelting the iron was salt. So they set up operations where they could find some cheap salt, the Byron Salt Flats. And here we have the mining buildings. So this lasted for a while until transporting the salt from Byron to those other cities, primarily San Francisco, where the smelting operations were located, got to be a little too expensive. There was no railroad there at that time, so it took a while and was too expensive. So they eventually closed down. The owner of the property at that time was a man named Lewis Mead. Now, Lewis had a decision to make. Is he shutting down operations entirely, or is he going to do something with the property? Now, what he noticed in his time working there was that there were a lot of people coming to the Byron Salt Flats for reasons other than mining the salt. They were coming there to use the mineral hot springs. So, strewn throughout this property in small openings were mineral hot springs, dozens of them. And folks would come there to partake in the waters. In this time, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, mineral waters were thought to have remarkable healing powers. And so folks would come there primarily to drink from the mineral hot springs. hoping that that would cure whatever ailed them. So Lewis Mead decided, you know what? These folks have all been coming here for free for a long time. It's not a mining operation anymore. I wonder if I could make money some other way. And so in 1878, he opened the first Byron Hot Springs Hotel. And basically what he did, he just put a roof over the top of all the other mining buildings and called it a hotel and started charging the folks that were showing up there anyway. But they were coming and they were paying. So Lewis Mead started marketing, and he marketed the remarkable heating powers of the mineral hot springs, and more folks partook in them. So this became a pretty successful operation for him out in Byron. And that lasted until 1901, when the entire hotel burned to the ground. So Lewis Mead had a decision to make. Are we folding up and heading out, or are we going to try to make a run of this thing? And he decided that he was going to stay, but if he was going to really operate the Byron Hot Springs Hotel for its purpose, he was going to do it right. So he hired a renowned architect, and the architect was the same man that designed the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco, Hotel del Coronado in San Diego, and the second Byron Hotel opened in 1902. And this is what it looked like. A pretty substantial upgrade from the previous operation, because this was now a luxury hotel. And they were marketing it as luxury. If you recall from the first images, the land was all barren, salt flats, hard to grow anything on it. And yet here, we've got plants thriving because they brought in up to 10 feet of good topsoil to create this courtyard. And so in essence, the Byron Hot Springs Hotel literally became an oasis in the wilderness in far east Contra Costa County. Just about anybody that was anybody, wealthy, famous, would make their way out to the Byron Hot Springs Hotel. Some came out there just for the resort destination. Others came out there for the heating powers of the water. The hotel had an in-house physician who could prescribe to you how much to drink from which mineral hot spring. You could soak in mineral hot mud baths that were mixed together in the hotel. So this literally became the most famous resort destination west of the Mississippi. That lasted until 1912, when the entire hotel burned to the ground. So now Lewis Mead has another problem. Give up or try once again. And he tried once again. Hired the same architect with one caveat. He asked him if he could design him a hotel that would not burn to the ground. And so in 1914, the third Byron Hot Spring Hotel opened. This time, it's got steel framework inside and brick on the outside. This hotel was not going to burn to the ground. Marketing throughout the country, still famous resort destination for the rich, the famous, and the folks that needed the healing, curing powers of the water. That lasted until about 1929. Because in 1929, the Depression hit. And the Great Depression meant that many of those rich folks that were attending the Byron Hot Springs Hotel were not so rich anymore. The folks that were coming here to partake in the healing powers couldn't afford it anymore either. So, the hotel remained a hotel for a while in the 30s, but it had lost its glamour. And then 1940s. 1940s, World War II. The US Army was looking for a place to have a secret interrogation center on the continental United States, and they found one. They leased the Byron Hot Springs Hotel for $1 from the owner, and they converted it to Camp Tracy. In 1943, they began bringing primarily Japanese and German naval officers that were captured, and here's where they held them for interrogation. Nobody in the surrounding area knew this was happening. They had fenced off the resort. You can see from the upper windows here, those are blacked out. That's where the prisoners were held. But they had fairly free reign of the property, because the idea in their interrogation at that time was not to torture these individuals. They would question them for sure, but then they let them roam the property. They'd go back to their rooms, and the prisoners would find out eventually that they could actually communicate to each other through the ventilation system, specifically designed so they could do that. But what the prisoners did not know is the Army had built drop-down ceilings in all of these rooms, and they had put microphones in them. So primarily what was going on was there were translators down in the basement listening in to the prisoners held up at the top. That was the primary interrogation method. So that lasted as Camp Tracy until 1945. The war ended. Property went back to the owners. And by that time, the owners had no interest in turning it back into a hotel and the famous resort that it was. But that was not the end of the Byron Hot Springs Hotel. Someone else purchased it. The Greek Orthodox Church. So in 1948, the Greek Orthodox Church consecrated Mission St. Paul. And the Byron Hot Springs Hotel and Resort became the retreat center of North America for the church. So folks would attend retreats there. They would run summer camps there for kids. And that lasted until about 1956. So as we can see, Byron Hot Springs had many lives throughout the years, not the least of which was a secret interrogation center. What of it today? Well, there is the shell of the third hotel. It did not burn to the ground, but it did fall into obvious disrepair. It went from bank ownership to someone purchasing it, trying to revive it and not being able to, back to bank ownership, to someone purchasing it, back to bank ownership, to what it is today. And the interior is completely gutted. But we can see there's still remnants of the oasis with the palm trees that somehow have managed to survive on the property. Currently, someone does own it again for the past about year and a half or 2 years. Once again, they want to see if they can revive it into an event center, and we'll see what happens. But this fascinating story, once again, was all put together into my second book. Byron Hot Springs, West Coast's most famous 1920s resort. Some of its famous guests we know attended. Fatty Arbuckle, the famous baseball player Lefty O'Doul, and the wealthy sugar baron Adolph Spreckles, famous for Spreckle sugar. These folks all stayed at the Byron Hot Springs Hotel. We know about its role as a secret interrogation center, but what I did not mention yet was the mystery. How about a renowned 137 karat diamond? Oh, and by the way, it's missing. If you would like to know where that diamond is, you just have to read my book. So that's book 2, Death at the Healing Waters. So 2 fascinating tales of real life history that I wove into these present day murder mysteries. Could there be a third book with local history as fascinating as those 2 stories? Well, if you're still with us on this this presentation, you'll probably gather that there is. Ghosts of Black Diamond is the 3rd book in the series. The inspiration, a cemetery. So this cemetery, present day, is called Rose Hill Cemetery. But in the late 1800s, this cemetery was known as Nortonville Cemetery because it is where folks were laid to rest, primarily those that lived in this town. And this is the town of Nortonville. And it would not be surprising if you have not heard of Nortonville in Contra Costa County, because Nortonville does not exist anymore. There is no town of Nortonville. But in the late 1800s, this was the largest town in all of Contra Costa County. And it was filled primarily with Welsh immigrant coal miners. They were mining the coal from up here in the foothills of Mount Diablo and sending it down to the wharfs via a small gauge railway to Pittsburgh, Antioch area, where ferries would pick it up and barges would pick it up, send it off to San Francisco, Stockton, Sacramento to burn as fuel for those growing cities. Here we see the schoolhouse, the back of Main Street, and here's the front of Main Street. Not much of a street, but it did have all of the buildings that you needed to run a town. Boarding houses, saloons, smith shops, and it had fraternal orders. So in learning about this and digging into the research, it led me on some really fascinating rabbit holes connected to the history. Here we have what I think is just an awesome photograph, 1898, of the Black Diamond mine crew. So Black Diamond was one of the mines. You'll notice just about everybody in this photograph would be a Welsh immigrant, including these 2 boys. Now, these 2 boys were called knobbers. The widest vein of coal underground that these men were digging through was the Black Diamond vein at 40 inches wide, which meant that these men mostly were lying on their stomach with a pickaxe, picking away at the coal and brushing it down a slope into a car to then be carried back to the surface. But once you got up a little ways, it took a lot to move up and down that 40-inch vein. So it was best if you had somebody short. The short folks that could go up and down that 40-inch vein easily were knobbers. So these boys, along with the mine crew, spent 6 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day underground. Their only light on the little lanterns on their helmet and occasional lanterns in the tunnels. Here they're carrying their lunch bucket because whatever they were going to eat during the day would have to be with them. So really fascinating story about the Welsh immigrants. And the most famous person in Nortonville at the time was the woman on the right, Sarah Norton. And Sarah Norton was a renowned midwife. One newspaper article from the era indicated Sarah Norton was known for delivering up to 400 children in the area and not losing a single one at childbirth. Remarkable. And that news article was printed right after her untimely, tragic death. All part of the story. But when digging into the lives of some of these folks, some of the connections became just incredibly unexpected. For example, here's the tombstone in that cemetery of a man named William Gething. Died in 1876 due to a mine explosion underground. It took the lives of many of the men. And what I was wondering in looking at some of this were these symbols etched into the tombstone. This one was easy to recognize. It was the Oddfellow syndrome, one of the fraternal orders. This one I was unfamiliar with. It's a shield, helmet, and crossed battle axes. In some of the other tombstones, there is an F, C, and B etched into the shield. So it took some doing, but I found out that that's actually the symbol for a fraternal order. The fraternal order, as we can see here in this symbol, has an FCB for friendship, charity, and benevolence. And it turns out, if you're not familiar, that's the symbol for the Knights of Pythias. The Knights of Pythias, a fraternal order that was created during the Civil War. I did some research into that to think about why, and where did this name originate from? The short answer is all I can give you now. If you're ever able to join any of my longer talks, I get to spend a lot of time, a lot more time going into depth about it. But it turns out the Knights of Pythias, as a fraternal order, which was based on living with friendship, charity, and benevolence, was inspired by a play called Damon and Pythias. This play was an ancient Greek play about two friends who demonstrated living by friendship, charity, and benevolence. But if you dig into the research behind the origin of that play, you find out that Damon and Pythias and their philosophy of friendship, charity, and benevolence was actually created by or inspired by this man. Turns out that many folks believe Pythagoras would be considered the very first philosopher. And if you're like me, you probably only know Pythagoras from his theorem in algebra class. But it turns out there's a lot more to the guy. But it was fascinating to see this almost direct connection between 500 BC ancient Greece and our backyard here in what was Old Nortonville of Contra Costa County. You can go to the cemetery. It is currently part of the East Bay Regional Parks. It's called Black Diamond Regional Preserve. You can hike up to the cemetery. I think, as mentioned, is called Rose Hill Cemetery now. You can find William Gething's tombstone. You can find Sarah Norton's tombstone. And you'll now know a little bit of the story behind those individuals. Put it all together in a book. We have the 19th century coal mining town and Welsh immigrants. A secret society based on ancient philosophy and mystic symbols, as I touched on just a little bit. Part of the mystery I don't have time to mention right now are encounters with the White Witch. Well, there's a cemetery there. So if you figure there's a cemetery, there might be something haunting the cemetery. And if you know of anybody that was raised in the Pittsburgh, Antioch area, they know about the legend of the White Witch. And how about the mystery? A legendary medieval sword. And guess what? It's missing. And if you would like to know where that medieval sword is, well, you got to read the book, Ghosts of Black Diamond. So that's book 3 in the series. Now, 3 books down. Is it possible there's any more fascinating history within our county? Well, guess what? Of course there is. So book 4, Beneath the Tangled Vines. And the inspiration for this one was a castle. This is known as the Winehaven Castle. And in the early 1900s, it was owned by the California Wine Association. Now, if you have not heard of it, it's not surprising because most people did not know that there was a castle in Contra Costa County, much less that it was owned by the California Wine Association or even who they are. But it turns out it was more than just that building. Winehaven was an entire small city. And in the early 1900s, after it opened in 1908, the Winehaven Winery was the largest winery in the entire world. Not just California, not just the United States. Winehaven was the biggest winery in the world. You can see their operations from where wine barrels were stored to where the processing of the grapes came in. There was a train track behind that would bring in grapes from all over the state of California. A wharf was built into San Pablo Bay where they could ship it out. They had their own hotel. They had their own cooperage for building the barrels. Huge operation. In digging into Winehaven, why it was built, where it was, we have to learn a little something about the whole county wine industry. And this was also something that was totally unexpected in doing research. So if we take a look at a 1904 map of Contra Costa County, a little hard to read or see, that yellow star represents the peak of Mount Diablo. So San Ramon, you folks are going to be down here. And if you follow the red ovals, they are each circling a vineyard and winery in the county at the time. And we know that these were not nearly all of them from writings at the time. But hopefully you can get the idea that Contra Costa County was filled with vineyards and wineries. Now, I tried to find some local images from that time of what Contra Costa County looked like with all these vineyards. If you look at a photo like this, looks a bit like the rolling hills of Tuscany, huge winery operation down here on the side, but it's not Tuscany. It's Clayton Valley. Or an image like this, these old vines from back in the day that just grow into the distance. Looks a bit like some of the French countryside, but guess what? That's Ignacio Valley. Or this image, sprawling orchards and vineyards, or as far as you can see, could be the rolling hills of Spanish wine country. But it's not, it's Pleasant Hill. Pleasant Hill looks a little different today. Or this place. This property is 2,300 acres of orchards and vineyards with this beautiful Italianate mansion sitting in the middle of it. Place in Italy, right? Well, no. This is the John Muir home in Martinez. Initially owned by Dr. Strenzel, John Muir's father-in-law. And John Muir inherited the house. And Martinez does not look anything like this anymore. including Highway 4, which would be running right back here behind the house. Think there isn't a castle in Contra Costa County? Well, think again. Because the Winehaven Castle, in fact, does still exist. I have not yet told you where it is. So hopefully you're thinking, running through your mind, where would a castle be located in Contra Costa County that was in fact the largest winery in the entire world? And the answer would be my hometown. Anybody remember from Dan reading my bio at the beginning where my hometown is? My hometown is Richmond. And so in the city of Richmond, you can find the Winehaven Castle to this day if you know where to look on the shore. So other fascinating local history. This one, I grew up nearby still, never knew anything about it. Brings us all to book 4, which actually begins with the devastating 1906 earthquake. And you may wonder why the earthquake initiates this book and its connection to the Winehaven Castle. And that is, in fact, a very good question. The world's largest winery, which I mentioned. I did not mention some of the people. So in doing the research for this particular book, a group of folks kept showing up in multiple areas related to this, and that were the Chinese immigrants. And if you're familiar with Chinese immigrants in Contra Costa County, perhaps you know where the secret underground tunnels are. And if you don't, well, you can find out. How about a cryptic message in a mysterious bone box? And if you're not sure what a bone box is, well, once again, you can find that out as well. But what then is the great mystery that ties this all together? How about a fortune in fine wine? And guess what? It's missing. Would you like to know where all of that fine wine is? Well, and of course, answers to the secret tunnels and the mysterious bone box, all in book 4. In the Shadow of Diablo is the series. This book, Beneath the Tangled Vines. So there we have the history that inspired my 4 novels. There are some themes that link them all together, where past meets present. So hopefully you got a sense that the past storyline is based on real people, places, and events. And then I have a present day storyline that's fictional, where fact meets fiction, and where mystery meets romance. So the mystery I touched on a little bit in each of the 4 novels. And in my present day storyline, as it turns out, my present day characters are 2 high school teachers. And if you have 2 high school teachers that spend so much time solving murders, it could be a little romance building between them. Put it all together and we have the 4 novels in the Shadow of Diablo. I always have to give credit to my crew because I self-publish. Everything is kind of done in-house. My editor-in-chief, as well as my chief financial officer, happens to be my wife, Jackie. All of my cover designs are done by my daughter, Veronica. If you prefer your books in audio narration on Audible, all of my Audible are done by my sister-in-law, Patrice. You can find my books on Amazon. If you prefer the e-reader, you can do Kindle. I mentioned they're also on Audible. And then lastly, I'd like to just mention, if you would like to learn more about any of that history, I do an hour and a half to 2 long lecture on each book separately. So I get to really dive deep into the history, lots of historical images to tie it all together. And in March, I'll be doing it for Las Vedanas College on Zoom. It's through something called the Lifelong Learning Series. So anybody can join them. And with that, I think I am done. So I'm going to turn it back over to Dan.
And no, you're not done.
No, I'm not done.
So, I read the third in the series, and I enjoyed the heck out of this. And I picked this book because I know people that have seen The White Witch, and you help kind of solve that mystery in here. So I really enjoyed this. Also, Dan brought up the Welsh miners, and I've got to hand it to him because he does an admirable job with Welsh, the language, in the book, which I kind of had to blip over most of the words because there's a lot of consonants and not enough vowels, it looks like.
You got that right.
So, you did such a good job talking about the four books. It struck me when I was listening to you today. The factual part of the four books would make a good historical fiction on its own.
Yeah, there's no doubt that it certainly could. Putting them together, sort of a regional history of the area. Yeah.
So, can you talk a little bit about the process? How do you select these places for a setting for your stories? How do you pull in elements to make a history or to make a mystery out of history?
Yeah, so the inspiration for each of them, I just kind of stumbled upon. My whole writing process, as you mentioned at the beginning, I was a high school science teacher and school administrator. I was not an English teacher, not a history teacher. So just writing the first book was really just a bucket list item. I just wanted to see if I could write a book, whatever it was going to be. No idea what I was going to write about, no idea about the writing process, if I could even do it. But as I went to this fundraiser at the John Marsh House in Brentwood, it inspired me to learn more about the history of John Marsh and his story. So from that, I thought, okay, this guy's got a super fascinating story. Can I turn that into to a book just to see if I can write it? I think I mentioned, I just decided I didn't want to write a biography about the guy. I wanted to try to make it a little bit more entertaining with the hopes that it might capture more people's attention and more people might learn about this real history. So then it was the challenge of how do you do that? And I just landed upon trying this concept of alternating storylines, past and present, past and present, past and present, and eventually the two storylines intertwine together and you learn about the real stuff. I had no idea if that was going to work or not. But people seemed to be able to follow it enough that obviously I ended up with the others. But typically what happened was in doing the research for one book at the historical societies, at libraries, museums, I would come across history that's connected, but maybe would not be enough story. So in doing this research about the Marsh House, I learned a little something about the Byron Hot Springs, which is far east Contra Costa. And I thought, oh, okay, let me just file that away. And then if it ever comes up again, I can go back and revisit. And so doing the research about the Byron Hot Springs, I came across a little bit about Nortonville and was like, oh, yeah, okay, let me file that one away and then come back. And then that one was like the rabbit hole of history that takes you back to 500 BC ancient Greece was just, that's just following connections in history. And then Winehaven, once again, was another one where in research, I just saw that, okay, the term Winehaven out there as something that was built in 1908. And I'm like, wait, in Richmond? I grew up in Richmond. I don't know anything about Winehaven. So little seeds that were planted as I was doing research. I then go back and visit and find out, oh my gosh, there's just such fascinating history.
So I don't think that I'm going to be much of a spoiler here, but one of your protagonists is actually a high school science teacher.
That is correct.
Any connection there?
Yes. So in trying to figure out how to do this whole writing process, folks kind of mentioned, you ought to write what you know. Well, the historical stuff was all facts. So this fiction part, writing what I know, meant I probably should write something about teaching high school because that I knew something about. So then it just fell into, well, let me see if I can make this character a science teacher. So often when I do talks, people ask, well, is that character based on you? And all I can say is people that know me personally, particular colleagues from my teaching days will say, yeah, that's based on you. So that's where it comes from a little bit.
All right. So you got obviously a couple fans now because one of them has asked about an electronic format for your books, and you covered that. But
Yep.
can you talk about it again?
Yeah, so multiple ways that you can find my books. You can go directly to my website at danhanel.com. You can look me up on Amazon. You can also find on Amazon the e-version in Kindle, or if you prefer Audible books, they're on Audible. I do want to mention, if you do go to my website, I have an interactive map. So as you read my books, you'll see that the characters go to many places. I have endnotes in the book to hopefully help folks try to figure out what's the real story, where the real people and places. Well, my interactive map has links directly to the real places associated with each book. So that's kind of a fun thing if you like following the history in there.
And that actually brings up another question we had is, would somebody be able to determine what is the fictional part and what is the historical factual part
Right.
in your stories? And I can say I had no problem with that, but I'd like to hear you talk about it too.
Yeah, no, that's a question that typically comes up. And I tried to make it as clear as possible to a point because I wanted folks to maybe do a little research on their own. So in the book, a couple things I have to help folks hopefully realize what's the real stuff. All of the historical stuff is based on real people, places, and events. But of course, I have to throw in dialogue and I throw in some other characters to tie it together. But I include some historical images with footnotes / endnotes to help people realize, oh yeah, that was a real person, or that's a real place. So that's one way they can do it just from reading the book. The other one then, as I mentioned, was on my website, the interactive map. Once again, they can go to these places, they can see which ones are real. And that's probably the best way. And then find out that, if they go to some of these places and they may realize, okay, well, that character doesn't show up anywhere. You probably made that one up.
So 4 books, you started with one thinking that was it. 1 begat 2, 2 begat 3, 3 begat 4. Is there more begatting to be done?
Gatting has begun. So I do have book 5 in the works. In doing the research for all these 4 books and learning about the people that lived in our region over the time, you'll see, there were the pioneers, there were the Welsh immigrants, there were the Chinese immigrants, etc. One group of people that I had always wanted to try to find a story to write about were the indigenous people.
Yeah.
So before all of these other folks that had lived here for thousands of years, this is a way of telling the story about them. So that's where my next research went. I can give a little teaser. I'm focusing on the era that of the end of the Spanish mission system, particularly Mission San Jose, which is where a lot of the Contra Costa County Native population was housed. and focusing on one of the indigenous leaders that led a rebellion. So he's got a fascinating story. There is a related mystery associated, and it's not giving away too much to say that something is missing. And if you want to know where it is, you'll have to read the book. However, it's going to take a while to finish because I've just started the writing process. So that'll take a little while, then the editing, all that good stuff. But book 5, hopefully before too long.
Well, there you go. So yeah, everybody's got 4 books to read now and 1 to look forward to.
There you go.
And if you want to hear more from Dan, he is at the San Ramon Historical Society tonight, I believe, right?
That is tonight. Just coincidentally, we have your folks, and then I was also asked by the Historical Society to talk in person to their group tonight. And so I will actually be there tonight. It will be roughly the same presentation, but I have a little more time. So there'll be a few more historical images that I get to throw in there with some of the story.
And they meet at the Black Bear Diner in Danville. And you're on at 7 o'clock tonight.
7 o'clock, I believe. Yeah.
What I saw.
Yeah.
I have to compliment you. You tell a great story orally as well as in print. And the slides were just fabulous. There were a whole lot of places. I've been to the Nortonville Cemetery, but there were a whole lot of places that I looked at and went, I had no idea that that was there.
Right.
And so your slides really brought those places to life for us today. So I want to thank you for doing that.
My pleasure. Always enjoy sharing the history, and it's always fun. It's a little tougher on Zoom because I don't get to see people's reactions.
Yeah.
Because typically when I do, especially my long talks, and I get to share some slides, and folks just are like, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea that this kind of history took place locally in our county, in the shadow of Diablo." So it's really fun.
So thank you for sharing the fact and the fiction this morning. That's all that we've got for questions. And so I'd like to thank Dan for being with us. And I'd like to thank you all for viewing us this morning. And if you missed any of our earlier programs, you can find them by visiting the museum's website at museumsrv.org. Dan's program will appear early next week. Join us on December the 19th at 11:30 when we wrap up 2024 with the history of Mount Diablo State Park, one of California's first state parks. It was actually established before the State Park Commission in 1921. John Gallagher, a board member for Save Mount Diablo, will talk about the fascinating politics and great public support that helped shape California's remarkable state park system. If you like these programs and want them to continue, we ask that you make a donation by going to the museum's homepage, museumsrv.org, and clicking on the Donate Now button. We are also in need of volunteers, docents, greeters, people to work on exhibitions. If you can give us some time, please contact the museum. I would like to take this time to thank you for viewing us this year. And on behalf of the museum, I want to wish you all a happy Thanksgiving. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Stay safe, and thanks for watching. Bye-bye.